Grischa, warmest welcome to the Genius Leadership Podcast.
Thank you.
Actually, I checked on the way here, and this will be the episode number 200 of this podcast. So,
congratulations.
Thanks, kudos to me. And it feels extra special to bring you on the show. And to Genius Leaders, why is special for me? Because we share the last name with this guy here, and that's for a reason, because he's a chosen partner for my life. And you've heard about him in many different contexts or examples in different episodes. So here he is, in flesh and blood, or for you today, more one-dimensional digital version of him. So Grischa, who are you? Let's just set a context of why have I invited you to the show.
Who am I? Professionally, I guess you mean.
Yes.
So I'm an associate professor, so I work in research, and originally mainly in computer science. That's my background, software engineering, but in the last couple of years, more and more in diversity and inclusion, and now most recently in the last 2-3 years or so, I work with neurodiversity, both in education, but also in the software context and software teams.
What brought you to those topics from more technical aspects of your research?
I think, so the diversity topic has always been a part of my education, I think, in the sense that I've been interested in I would say, fairness of treating students in the same way, no matter where they come from. And this is, various dimensions, whether this is now gender, but usually in the education, I think it started for me with their prerequisites, whether they already have a lot of background or not. So that's the diversity angle. And then neurodiversity, it started concretely with a colleague whose son was diagnosed with ADHD. So that's how we started discussing this. But I think even before, I've always been around sort of mental disease or mental disorders. So in my hometown, there's a large psychiatry. So I've had that connection. But concretely, it was the colleague who started discussing this.
Mm-hmm. I feel like that's a common thread for a lot of people who get into the research or being active in the field of trying to promote the neurodiversity, inclusion, etc., that they have someone affected by the unfair treatment or anything like that, or themselves. Is that your observation as well, after years of working with that?
Yeah, I think most people get through it through personal connections, and the majority of those directly affected. So you see lots of researchers that have a neurodivergent condition. But yeah, then there are family stories or colleagues or something like that, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and we discussed with you what I wanted to ask you about, and you were like, oh, this gets very generic and very broad. So we decided to narrow it down to ADHD, and we'll explain in a moment why, maybe. But before that, you said now, for example, neurodivergent. What did you use? Neurodivergent?
Did I use people, individuals,
No.
conditions?
Conditions, yeah, exactly.
Probably.
So can you explain to us, what is neurodiversity? Is it diseases? What do you mean by conditions? What are we talking about?
So this is a bit difficult because neurodiversity is an umbrella term, and it's actually an activist term that comes from an autistic person who said, well, this shouldn't be about a diagnosis or a medical issue, it's just regular brain diversity. So it's basically people that have a slightly different way of cognitive brain function, and that's what distinguishes them. But this term comes from saying this should not be a medical thing that has to be treated. Mm-hmm. But it's generally understood that it includes diagnoses like ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, dyslexia, and just various learning disabilities in the medical sense. Mm-hmm. But yeah, you have a lot of people in that group that say they don't want to be treated like they have a disease that needs to be cured, but rather they want to be accepted that they just function differently.
Mm-hmm. So it is about like, okay, we have different bodies in the world,
yeah.
Those 7 or 8 billion, how many are we now? People have different physical abilities or physical just characteristics of themselves, and that's the same with our mind. So the conditional body in us, quote unquote, is also different.
Exactly. So there is a natural variety. It's just that these disorders in the classical sense might just be sufficiently different that individuals with those conditions typically experience problems in their life, whether that's education or at work or in personal life. And that's why from the beginning they were classified as disorders. But that's exactly the question. Should it not rather be just a spectrum of a general diversity that you have in how your brain works? Just like you have people that have certain preferences, are maybe more or less creative, have more or less concentration, but there's a spectrum of that.
I see.
Yeah.
And we decided to focus on the ADHD, and why so?
So, why so? I have focused a lot on ADHD recently, and I think...
It's funny to focus on ADHD.
Yes.
Sorry, I had to comment on that.
So I find ADHD interesting because it doesn't yet have as much focus, it's not as much in the spotlight as maybe autism spectrum. I think one of the reasons is that a lot of individuals with ADHD don't necessarily behave in an obviously different way. So you might not see it as much. And also in many cultures and historically, it's, I think, very misunderstood as people that can't just sit still or so, that basically can't behave. And I think that's why it's an interesting field to look at, because these are people that are in the work life, they're in university, they are out there, and you might not notice that, and a lot of them might not know it, but they experience struggles. So it's very common that you have adults that have been diagnosed 1 or 2 years ago, but they have a history of 30 years of problems in various areas. So that's why I think it's interesting.
And what are the problems that you usually face without realizing that belongs to the ADHD?
So ADHD is, to briefly jump to the medical side, it's a condition that deals with attention deficits, so difficulties paying attention, concentrating, organizing things. But it can also be on the hyperactivity side, so not being able to sit still, for example, or constantly having to somehow move your hands or do things. And then you can have both of that. So it's essentially, it's called 3 different presentations that you have. But most common in adults is the attention part, so hyperactivity is more common in kids. And for the attention, it's basically typical things that you might have to do at work, in any kind of job, are difficult, like planning ahead, controlling impulses, whether you want to now do something that's more interesting than something else, focusing on something, especially if it's tasks that you perceive as boring, having to write up a report, or doing something that's interesting, but then finishing up the last 10% of that when you feel like it's already done. So typical things like that. And this can then also go over into other areas. So it's very common that people with ADHD have, for example, anxiety, depression, and so that's kind of related. But these are typical issues that they experience. I
mean, you described those issues and I was like, okay, it sounds like 95% of population or so have at least one of those. So where does it become a condition that you actually classify?
So there we are again on the side whether this is now a medical thing or it shouldn't be. If you have the standpoint that this shouldn't be a medical diagnosis and it shouldn't be treated in any way or cured, then you just have to accept that it is a continuum, and some people might have that more or less. In the way this is diagnosed is that you have to have relatively severe issues in, I think it's 3 out of 6 or 7 areas, to the level where this causes problems in your life. So things, for example, by regularly not meeting deadlines or so on. And everyone has that, but it's that's exactly, I think, where it's often misunderstood. It's at the level where it really causes you problems.
Okay, got it.
Or things like, not missing deadlines or having issues with other people because you have issues concentrating or planning ahead, estimating time, or those kind of things.
And what have you studied within that? I mean, you can probably go 1,000 different ways. What have you focused on so far?
So we have done, and I say we because it's a group of people that I work with, so it's not me alone. we have on the one hand looked a bit at education and tried to make essentially classes or the classroom more friendly towards people with neurodiversity in general, and includes ADHD. And that has a lot to do, starting from relatively basic things with, like, for example, having assignments or lecture slides styled in a certain way, that there is less stuff that distracts you, because that captures attention, so that might be an issue. If I have my lecture slides are, for example, very flashy, and you might have a person with ADHD that is simply not able to listen to you because it's so distracting. So that's something we have focused on, and various other things in this context. For example, trying to be a bit more direct with, here are the things you have to do, instead of giving them a 5-page text that is very vague and all over the place. So we have done that, and we're working more on scaling this from 1 or 2 courses to a larger part of the university. On the other end, and that's maybe more the professional work life, I have looked at how people with ADHD perform, or how they experience their work life and how they work with others. So we have interviewed a lot of people with ADHD and what their experiences are specific to software engineering, but a lot of that is very general, like, for example, having issues with deadlines and that leading to anxiety or so on. So that's something we have studied quite a lot. And now the next step, which we'll want to work on, is basically building better methods or processes for mixed teams that include neurodivergent engineers, so that they can work better, essentially.
So does that include like rules how to collaborate, or is it some specific tools that they need to use to project manage their work? Or
it's a mix of those things, I would say. So for example, in software engineering specifically, you already have a lot of practices that are quite helpful. So for instance, a common thing that is done is that you estimate how much time you take for the work you do in a team. So it's not one person that says this will take half a year or this will take 2 weeks, but you do that jointly to avoid that you have any strong biases. And that's, for example, something that quite helps those people, because if you have an issue with estimating time, hopefully your teammates will balance that out somehow. So that's already in place, but then there are a lot of things that can be improved, and that goes from, I think meetings are a hot topic, because people with ADHD have a hard time actually participating in meetings. Again, this is something that everyone has, but to the point where they just zone off completely immediately because it's not interesting or something like that. There's no agenda. So improving, for example, meeting agendas and how those meetings are conducted. Tooling plays an important role, especially in software engineering, because you have people that have technical know-how, so they can build those tools and they can improve them. And that goes from relatively basic tools, like maybe a phone app that reminds you of things. But it could also, and that's what we don't know yet, we haven't built them yet, but maybe more advanced tools that actually help you with project management, or reminders, estimation, or those kind of things. And then finally, it's maybe also the social side of it. As I said earlier, that it's quite common that people get anxious, for example, and this could be something like you have a meeting tomorrow where you need to report on what you have done. But it's fairly common that people with ADHD have very heavy productivity swings. So they haven't really done anything for an entire day, and they get really anxious about it, and that becomes an endless loop, essentially. They can't concentrate because they're so anxious, which means they don't get anything done. So I think working on that is also interesting and relevant. And there, for instance, it might also go a bit more into the dimension of actually coaching the teams that they work better together. Because that's maybe also an important thing. I mean, we're talking about all the problems these people have, but it's also about the rest of the team, that they learn how to deal with that better. And it's not just someone with ADHD that has to fix and adapt to that.
I know that you're using the Guide to Me in your courses. Mm-hmm. Do you see how that, or have you actually looked into whether that's anyhow helpful to the team, for the teams of students to collaborate when there are neurodiverse people on the team?
We haven't done that yet, no. We might do that next week. So it is planned.
Stay tuned.
Yeah, it is planned to do that. I think the problem we're having in the education sphere, especially in my particular course where I'm doing that, is that we don't have enough time to spend with the students. So I think this is probably not a tool that you just give to a team and say, let's go, but you have to follow up and you have to coach them through that. And then you also have to consider that this is a university context where maybe the teams don't behave just as professionally as you would expect in practice. So I'm not too hopeful for students that this is an amazing tool that you just give to them, but it's maybe it's a starting point to work with. So I do think this is relevant, but you also have to consider, and this is something we haven't quite talked about, but a lot of people that are neurodivergent hide that because of the stigma. I mean, there are lots of stories of people losing their jobs because they told the boss that they have whatever.
Oh, really?
ADHD is more common in autism, I think, but it's fairly common. You would hope that in lots of countries this is not a thing anymore, but it is happening. And also, so that's why a lot of people hide it. You also have other people that have a very strong opinion in this neurodiversity terminology. They say this shouldn't be a label, so I'm not disclosing it because it's not what defines me. So the issue is you're dealing, of course, with a lot of invisibility that you're not aware of that. You might feel like you have someone in the team that behaves or works in a slightly different way, or maybe in an extremely different way, but yeah, that's the question, how to deal with that. So that's also why a lot of what we do, we're trying to not find the cure for those people, but find general ways that can improve teamwork and hopefully help these people in particular. But it shouldn't be because you are sick, you get this particular special treatment, but it should be something you can choose to do or not.
Okay, so I think it could be good to focus now on the second part that you mentioned. So first you talked about, what we try to do with courses to make them a bit more inclusive for everyone, and you mentioned the styling and so on. And so Genius Leaders, if you're interested in that for your professional context, just Google or maybe reach out to Grischa. He can provide some guidelines on specifics, which fonts are good to use, about the contrasts on the slides, etc. Is what I know a bit.
Colors,
colors, etc. But then if we focus for the specifics of Genius Leadership on the corporate environment, what have you found in the interviews with people who are in the workplace? Maybe let's start with those. First of all, those people you interviewed have known or know that they have ADHD, right? So that is already one thing. So there we're not covering what happens to people who don't know, in a way.
Well,
or do you have something to say about that? Maybe they covered that a bit about their experiences before they got diagnosed. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, I think it is those kind of things I've already mentioned. Maybe you have the tendency to miss deadlines, to because of that, get bad performance reviews, have extreme productivity swings. In particular, I mean, ADHD is very often misunderstood as this, that you get very easily distracted. Something flashy and you go like, oh, which is to some extent is true. It's easier to get distracted, but very often it's a matter of actually getting very focused on something in particular. So it's not like they cannot concentrate or focus at all. It's just there is a particular thing that captures their interest at any given point in time, and then that's the only thing you can think of. And it's impossible, like we all have that, there's something on our mind, but if you don't have ADHD, you're usually relatively capable to say, okay, I'll try to block that out a bit, and now I work on this. But for people that have that, it's basically impossible. So I had, for example, one interviewee that said, I'm right now renovating my house, so that's all I'm thinking about. And it's really hard to do anything else, because non-stop, that's just in your brain. And some other time it was some new computer game that was released, and that was a person, or it is a person that is a CEO of a company. So it's not like a programmer that you could say maybe it's not that important, but it's actually the person in the company that is leading the entire thing can only think about a computer game. And so that's what a lot of people experience. And I think what a lot of those people that got diagnosed late tell me is that they would use words like, I thought I was just shit at everything. And now I have an explanation for that, or you have ways to work with that. But especially, they essentially had barriers everywhere that they realized that it's not working out. And a lot of it is concentration, deadlines, performance, ups and downs, and so on.
So from that, what I hear is it brings value to get that diagnosed, because not because then you have an excuse, but more about what you're actually working on, what is the root cause of all the issues that you're facing, or maybe many of the issues you're facing in your social life, in your professional life. So that's one thing that we can maybe emphasize, that it's important to get it, even though it's stigmatized, and apparently it's not always green light to share it with everyone afterwards, depending on the culture within the company, within the country. But for the person themselves, it's very important to understand that, because then you can know what kind of tools to use. Yeah. Good.
Well, that's maybe also where you need to understand that depending on the country you're in, it might take a very long time to get a diagnosis. So maybe it's not even that important that you have that diagnosis. Okay. If you don't plan to have it as a tool to disclose and say, I need these kind of changes at work. But if you have the feeling that this is something you could have, you could maybe just look for what kind of advice is given for people with ADHD, and maybe that's things that help you as well, whether or not you have the diagnosis. Then there are other things. I mean, a lot of people with ADHD really benefit from medication and from cognitive behavioral therapy. So there are tools. They don't help for everyone, for sure, but for some they are very, very useful. And that's, of course, something where you need a diagnosis. But there are lots of things that can help. And a lot of these are actually standard productivity recommendations, I would say. So, switching off all the notifications on your phone, removing all the stuff there that takes concentration and focus, like social networks or so on, and really just having it as a planning tool, for example.
Okay. What else? Let's go into what you found in the interviews that really help your interviewees to thrive at work. What helps? I mean, an understanding team certainly helps, or boss, or whoever, supportive people at the company help. I have to think about that. I mean, obviously, what a lot of them say, because of this interest part, it's really hard to do boring stuff. You have to identify what you find interesting and work with that. And some of them very clearly said that might mean you have to change your job because it's just not fitting you. A lot of them, and that's maybe interesting to this podcast in particular, I mean, you see, of course, a lot of people that have their own business. And I don't think it's the whole story, but definitely part of the explanation is that they had a lot of bad experiences somewhere else. So if they're their own boss, they can tailor things. Flexibility in the environment helps. So if you can work from home or at work, you can change around the environment, what kind of distractions you have. That can help. Interestingly, some people talk about positive distractions. So they might, for example, one person said at home they have their dogs, and that's the kind of distraction they need now and then to then get back into focus. Interesting. So if you don't have a dog, or if you can't commit, or you're allergic, what are the other examples of positive distractions?
It doesn't have to be a dog. It's just a matter of finding things that are actually good routines that keep you productive, whether that's, maybe going to the coffee machine now and then or so, but figuring out what are the things that actually distract you versus the things that help. Maybe it's putting on the dishwasher and you have the background noise or something like that. At work, it's a lot of the very common productivity tools. Like, for example, being able to have a sign at the door saying, now I'm focusing, because that's another issue is context switches. Whereas most of us have issues with switching context. Here we're talking about people that sometimes they're focused on something, they get interrupted, it takes them over an hour to get back to where they started. So it's really, really extreme. And other tools like that, like, for example, being able to block certain days where you don't have meetings, because then you have this issue, like there's a meeting in 2 hours, I'm not even managing to get started with anything else before that, or those kind of things.
So you talk to people from what kind of companies? Because now I'm hearing that, and I imagine a lot of people who go through my corporate workshops, for example, and they're like, yeah, good luck, yeah, blocking one day off to not have any meetings, So it's like, what kind of world are you living in? So just give us a context of sizes. It was about software engineering companies.
I actually don't know all of the sizes or the context, so this is hard to really quantify. As I said, lots of entrepreneurs or contractors that work independent, so they are much more in control. And but then there are some of the big companies are quite known for being very supportive there. So for example, Microsoft is well known for being very good at including people with neurodiversity, starting from the job interview where you can disclose, for example, I have autism spectrum disorder. I need a different interview because the regular way of interviewing just doesn't work. So I think medium-sized companies are probably the issue. The very big ones usually have very good diversity and inclusion programs. But then it's again at the level where you have to disclose it because otherwise it might get tricky. Software development is a bit special because in the ideal world, the way companies work nowadays, according to the agile software development idea, is that you have actually a fixed team and you work on a single product all the time. And that helps a lot, of course, if you're not on 5 projects in parallel and you constantly switch. So that idea helps, but there are maybe not that many companies that truly live that. I think there are a lot that pretend they would like to do that, but then they still put people in 5 different teams or so on. But yeah, I think being your own boss or being in a really large company can actually help.
Interesting.
One thing that came up repeatedly, and then that's maybe an issue, and that could be interesting if there are CEOs listening and they're in control of that, is that I think in software engineering and in many other businesses, we have a very standard career path. So in software engineering, you start as a junior developer, and you slowly go up, and then maybe at some point you're some kind of team manager and so on. And it turns out that is really difficult for lots of people with ADHD, because these first roles are the ones where it's very much about regular delivery and boring tasks very often. So it's really, that's exactly why a lot of these people drop out and maybe start their own thing, because they just realize that this doesn't work for them. Whereas at the level where, for example, I had a large amount of people that work in information security, that seems to be one of those jobs that seems to work really well, because it's about, for example, investigating incidents. There has been some security breach and you need to figure out what happened. And these kind of puzzles and creative thinking are really something that fits. So what we are discussing, but that's again the question of how do you put this in practice, is can there be any kind of alternative career path that might fit better? So not only about the interview and getting into the company, but what then? Yeah.
What else? Like you mentioned supportive team and manager, and that was the first thing that you said about what helps people with the ADHD to actually thrive at work and be good at what they do. So what can we do, we as genius leaders listening, to set up that? So is it about trainings for the team? How do we build awareness? How do we introduce the superpowers that ADHD can actually provide for the whole team if a team member is really embracing that?
So I think awareness is the first step, and that might just mean that you actually need to inform yourself about it. And so not only spread awareness, but actually build your own awareness of what that means. Because I think there are lots of behaviors that we still are trained to think of as they're unprofessional. This is slightly more common maybe with autism, where, for example, we have communication issues. So we feel like this person is rude because they talk in a certain way or write in a certain way that's just very direct. But then also things like deadlines and maybe noticing those things in team members, that this might be something that's going on, whether the person knows about it or just doesn't disclose it or whatever. So I think awareness is the first step, and then also for the team. But then it's really, I think a big part is this cultural aspect of actually working on having a workplace where those things are accepted, and it's accepted to talk about it, that I have this difficulty and it's it's not necessary. Well, it is a weakness in a certain context, but you can work with it. It's not something that then leads to you getting bad performance reviews or so on. So I think that's something that helps. And then it's always about individual accommodations. What can you do? And for some people, if it's a relatively large company and you have, for example, a person with ADHD in a management position, maybe it's about giving them certain support, for example, some kind of secretary or coach that helps them with the boring stuff that they need to do, but they might just not be able to do it themselves. There's one more thing that comes up regularly, and it's in the psychology literature. It's called body doubling. That's that you sit together and do stuff. You don't have to do the same thing, but just being in the same room with someone. So that's something that helps.
Interesting. So again, I need to pause on that because this was a bit new for me. I was reading through the Guide to Me reflections from my students, and quite a lot of them reflected on that because one of the questions was about how do I get productive, right? And they were mentioning that for some or for many at least, it's a silent place, it's a calm place where they can focus. I know people who like to work at the bar on Friday, sitting with their laptop. But then they were mentioning, some students were mentioning that they prefer to sit listening to music, but someone next to them studying. And that, like seeing the other person studying helps them. Yeah. So there is a psychological term for that.
Yeah, it's called body doubling.
And tell me more about it. I'm curious.
Yeah, so this is it's essentially what you say, that you sit together with someone else, and this can even be remote for some people, that you're just on a call, and everyone is working on their own stuff, but just the fact that everyone works keeps you focused. And that generally works for many people. It works particularly well for lots of people with ADHD. There's one interesting aspect to that, and that's something we just had in a study that we're now publishing, hopefully. But maybe one step back. It's very common for people with ADHD to have autism as well. So there's what we call comorbidity. There's a very large overlap. And it seems like lots of people with autism as well, since they have more issues with maybe social communication, social language, this also works for them, but it tends to be only if they know the other person. Otherwise, they feel watched in many cases. So it's a bit difficult, or it's not that straightforward. But yeah, generally seems to help.
All right, interesting. So it is about the flexibility. Okay, starting awareness. Flexibility, providing whatever we can to accommodate for their specific needs and superpowers, because that's what I hear with some clients of mine who have ADHD and have known it and learned how to deal with it. Some other people I'm connected to, they say that once I've managed to manage it in a good way, it has become a superpower. Just this ability of focusing undisrupted on something that I'm really interested in, and being able to nerd into it.
It's a bit of a difficult term, and actually some people from the neurodiversity group really don't like it, because they feel like...
The superpower, you mean?
Yeah. Because they feel like, no, it's not. It's a strength like every other strength. It's just that, we do some things better than others, and that's just normal. Yeah. It shouldn't be the superpower.
It's not a superhero thing.
No, but it's maybe also acknowledging that very often the stereotypes we have, if we look at ADHD or autism, are very much the Hollywood genius person that can't talk to other people but is extremely smart or something like that. And I think that's also what a lot of them want to get away from, that maybe these are extreme cases, but it's a spectrum, and they have strength that distinguish them from lots of people without these conditions, but it doesn't necessarily, or some really react to the superpower thing. Some say it and are like the term, but it's a bit sensitive.
Okay, I'll be more aware of that, of using it. But as I said, I'm just more referring to what other people are saying about themselves. You mentioned stereotypes, right? This extreme case of Hollywood genius. What are the other stereotypes that we haven't discussed maybe yet, but you think it would be interesting and informative for genius leaders to understand?
Yeah, what are the other stereotypes? I mentioned one earlier, is this idea of the kid that just can't sit still, and it's just about not behaving, basically. I think that's a very strong stereotype. It's probably more on kids, but there is a risk, of course, I mean, I'm in university, my students are adults, but still we might treat them as kids. So I think that's a difficult stereotype to go like, yeah, this person just can't be professional. And I think that's something to be aware of. I think generally the stereotype of that these people are stupid in a certain way, just because they might have difficulties with some things that that are natural for people without the conditions. So I think in this case, the dyslexia is, for example, really interesting. So people that have difficulties reading and writing, where, you could have a person that is basically takes half an hour to write 2 sentences. And we're very quick maybe to dismiss that a person is not intelligent enough or whatever, but they can be extremely bright, and it's just the writing that is the problem. If you allow them, talking about a corporate environment, if you allow them instead of writing an email, dictating it, it would just be as professional as if someone else would write it. And I think that's something to look into as well, and just accept that this is not an intelligence or behavior or thing like that.
I notice it with the clients that I have who know that they have the ADHD, that they prefer the voice memos, and it's a much easier way for them to communicate with me and actually get their thoughts out without distractions somehow. Maybe it's because they don't have to stare at the phone while typing. While you're typing the message, then the notifications come up or something, you start thinking about something else, but speaking it out really helps them to actually get it out to me.
Yeah, one thing we see in neurodiversity generally, I think, of course, maybe not for everyone, but it's that we have lots of people that are more visual thinkers. And you could say that the neurotypical group, the people that don't have any of that, maybe we are just a bit we have a disorder of relying too much on written stuff, and we can't really think as much visually. So that's something you see, that you have lots of people that like drawing stuff, maybe dictating, because they think about whatever they're dictating at the same time. So yeah, and that's also something that is known. Originally, it's actually from architecture or civil engineering, but there is a concept called universal design, which is nowadays quite popular in education, but I think it's also something for the corporate environment, is that you generally try to provide alternatives and choice to people, and they can then pick whatever fits them best. So instead of saying, here's a book that you have to read for the course, is there an alternative way of doing that? Maybe you have an audiobook, for example, and then you can choose, do you listen to it or do you read to it? Because in the education context, I don't care whether the person has actually read the book, as long as they have the knowledge. And as I mentioned, if you have dyslexia, it's a completely different story than if you don't have that. And this just helps. And it also helps for people that don't have a disorder or no diagnosis or whatever, because if you prefer an audiobook, you just go for that. So that's something where now the technological changes really help, I think, where you go into things like, I mean, it's fairly standard now that you have meetings that are automatically transcribed, for example. And I think these are tools that really help. A lot of these people and everyone else.
Okay. So a lot of things that, as you said, what you mentioned are standard productivity tools that would help everyone, but of course would make a big difference in the quality of life or perception of quality of life for people with ADHD. Is there anything that you feel like, okay, that might sound super weird for neurotypical people, but it's super helpful for people with ADHD?
Nothing comes to mind right now, I think, because we're exposed to these people all the time. It's estimates are 10 to 20% of the population. So I think we have seen how people cope with the difficulties they face, and that's why we're used to that. And I think it's just a matter of accepting them. And for example, one point where society probably needs to work more on the acceptance is the whole social aspect, that you have lots of people that might just have difficulties in general social situations, and they have their ways of coping with that, whether that means I don't go to the pub with my team because I just can't, and that's okay. It's not that I don't like them or I don't care about them, it's just I can't. I think that's what we need to work most on, but it's not exactly weird or surprising. We have seen those things and we know them. It's just that it's not a matter of interest or being rude, but it's just different ways of working.
Yeah. So it goes back to awareness, as we discussed. You mentioned 10 to 20% are estimated to have it. Right now, it feels like everyone says like, "Oh, I have ADHD. I have ADHD. I have ADHD." So, what is going on right now? Is it something that we kind of over-diagnose ourselves, or is that really that I'm in a bubble where neurodiverse people are overrepresented? What's your thought?
I think it's a mix. So there is a lot of awareness right now, which I think leads to this. Generally, more diagnosis, probably also over-diagnosis. Mm-hmm. The thing is, you hear the symptoms or the difficulties or the strength that I described, and a lot of them, like your initial comment, was like, you go, I have that as well. So I think it's this distinction between having some difficulties with some of these aspects, or as I said, having several of them that really impact your life. That's a difference, and that's one aspect of it that maybe we're too quick to say I have this condition. But it's also that, for example, if you want to get a professional diagnosis, the first step is usually a screening questionnaire. So there is a questionnaire, a standardized questionnaire, and that one is very, very inclusive. So if you just use that as a tool of saying I have ADHD, you would very much overdiagnose people, because it's meant to capture a lot of people. But then for the whole diagnosis, you actually have to talk to a psychologist. The psychologist usually also talks to family and friends and get an impression. So it's really a one step of many. And I know that in several countries there is at least the argument it's very easy to get a diagnosis. Whether that really means you have it, I don't know. But also maybe it's the question, is it really important?
I just wanted to ask, is it bad if you get the diagnosis but you don't really have it?
Yeah, it is probably bad if you then just use it to get medication and you don't really need them. I think that's unnecessary. But I also feel the other way around. It just doesn't matter that much if we get to the level where we are actually inclusive enough as a society that it doesn't really matter whether you have the stamp or not, or you just have the possibility to make choices that help you to what extent ever is necessary. Yeah.
What is your hope with this line of work of yours? What do you want to see as a change in the next several years, up to 10?
Well, I really hope we get to the point where this is just stuff that is openly talked about and it's not a problem. Because on the one hand, I see all the individual issues that people have experienced and all the stories behind it, and some of them are shocking, like as I said. People losing their jobs. I have interviewed people that have, most likely because of these conditions and the challenges they have a background of drug abuse and things like that. So it's really, I think that would be something that we should really get away from. But then also to the level where, this is about diversity that ultimately helps. And there's lots and lots of evidence in science that if you have diverse teams, they build better products. If you have diverse societies, they are more open, they're more innovative. And I think getting to that level where we recognize or we can work with these differences will just lead to better outcomes. So I hope that we're there in 10 years. Maybe a bit optimistic, but
let's see. There's a lot of shit hitting the fan all the time around. So maybe we'll get distracted here and there, but maybe that actually helps us as well. And with that goal for 10 years, if we roll back to every Genius leaders listening, what would be the first step? So for example, if they say, listening to us, they're like, okay, I actually have no idea. Then let's take the beginners, so to say. Then maybe it is about the self-awareness. What would be the first step to raise the self-awareness? And then if it's a leader who already knows something, what could they do as the one singular step?
So if we look at leaders, or if we look at a corporate environment now, of course, leaders might be somewhere else, but I think corporate covers a lot of that. I think there is one very good report that is maybe good to start looking at, which is called Neurodiversity at Work. I forgot which group has done that, but it's essentially a large survey with neurodivergent people, but also their employers, and I think it gives a very good overview. It's not very long, and it shows you a bit what are the typical problems these people have, what are the typical strengths they have. That's something we haven't talked that much about, but I think that's really important to recognize that this is not only about, helping people, but also they have strength that we can actually use. And then things like what are typical accommodations that help them. And I think that's a really good starting point, just to get informed of what is neurodiversity, what does it mean in the workplace, and how can you help. So that's something I would probably recommend. And again, even though it's corporate, I don't think it only applies to corporations. It can apply to education, it can apply to NGOs or volunteering work. It doesn't really matter.
We can find it and put the link in the show notes for our
and it's
listening.
open and it's fairly well written. It's not a very heavy academic piece. So.
And for the individuals who are not necessarily leaders, I guess that report would also help, but anything else that we can suggest?
Yeah, I think the report helps. Other than that, maybe look around in your team, in your company, and try to recognize this a bit more. Like what is going on? Do I have colleagues that might struggle with this? And then just maybe first go inward and think, what can you do about it? And but other than that, I think getting informed is the most important step.
Do you want to cover a bit of the strength, since you mentioned that we haven't done it? We discussed that, okay, there is a focus, right? If they're interested, then they really can be focused on one thing, but anything else that...
Yeah, so talking about ADHD, this is slightly different in the different conditions. They tend to be very creative in the sense... So this is something that the research is not quite sure about, but at least in the sense of divergent thinking. So this kind of out-of-the-box ideas. The question is always whether those ideas are useful or not. That's usually the other aspect of creativity. So, but at least they can come up with completely different ideas, which is usually very difficult for neurotypical people. So that's something, and obviously creativity is important in various areas of life and of business. So I think that's a very clear strength. Another one is that we see that lots and lots of individuals with ADHD have really broad interests. So they're really all over the place. And this, part of that might explain this divergent thinking, that they have so much broad experience that they can easily connect to other things. But it also means in a work context that they're very often, they don't really stay in their team, but they're interested in what are we doing overall in the big picture. And this is, of course, again, something that a quality that you want to have in lots of people, and whether it's a manager or it's someone in software. It's, for example, very important to not just be in your bubble. So I think that's a very strong one as well, that is important. So these are I would say the common things that we see in ADHD. We're currently looking more into that, whether they're actually specific to ADHD or not. Some of these qualities, for example, one thing that we didn't really have on our radar, but it comes up repeatedly, is that they seem to be good at mentoring. Again, maybe that's because of the broad interests, that it's easier to point out things that are a bit outside of their focus. But there we're not really sure whether this has something to do with just the people we interviewed. But I think those kind of things. And then the last one I mentioned already is the ability or the interest to solve puzzles. So really figure out complicated things and find a solution to them is very common, which, as I said, this is useful in the software world for example, information security, or for testing a system, trying to break it and finding ways. So, and again, this applies to other areas, I think. There are quite some interesting things, I would say.
Wonderful. All right. Anything that you think we haven't covered that I should have asked you, being a better host?
I think we covered this quite well. Obviously we had to focus on ADHD. There's a lot more to say about the other conditions, but I do think this, was quite good.
Wonderful. Then we can get going for our weekend.
on Saturday.
Yeah, so Genius Leaders, we're recording this on the Saturday. That's our part of our time, quality time as a couple. That's what we do. That's how much he loves me. Thank you so much, Grischa, for sharing. And I think it's... I'm very happy that you found this area for yourself because you're passionate about it, and I think it's much easier to find the direct relation to or direct value, which was a bit harder for you to find with the previous research areas where you were sometimes wondering how much value it is. But I think here
it's part of being a researcher. I think that you sometimes wonder what you're doing, or regularly. I think that's. But yeah, it certainly helps that there is direct value to people. Yeah. And we're getting, this is also nice in this area of research that you actually get lots of feedback from the individuals that finally someone is listening to them and is actually taking this serious. So yeah.
Exactly. I think it's very important because, as you said, there are so many positive aspects that we can embrace and actually value from as companies, as societies, as families, communities. So it's amazing that people from different research areas come together. I know you collaborate with people from education, people from psychology, and it's super cool because then we can finally maybe move the needle forward and get to the goal that you had for 10 years from now. So keep doing the good work. I'm proud of you with that.
Thank you.
And to you, Genius Leaders, let me know if you should invite this big part of my life and very important part to me of my life again, and talk about any other specific condition within neurodiversity or any other topic. So I would be happy to do that. I would need to check, of course, with Grischa, but he's happy to do that. But maybe subject to negotiation. And to you, Genius Leaders, I want to remind, as always, that I see you, I feel you, I love you. And I do believe that we can build a more inclusive societies, and we can all take a small step this week to make it a goal, but meet that goal sooner. Take care and talk to you next week.